while at the same time making it easier for Nazi Party members and Nazi agents to have guns to carry out their work. So there you had the result of a gun control law that was passed in 1928 having the horrific effects in 1938 and beyond.
Some people may have trouble seeing any connection between the laws of the dictatorial Third Reich and the laws enacted by representatives of the American people. Richard, is it fair to compare Nazi German laws to American laws?
That's a very fair question, too. And look at it this way. If you have a law that operates in a way that disarms the innocent citizen and does not disarm the bad guy, then it's a bad law. Now, true, the Nazi regime had an evil intent. It was a well-known evil intent, as a matter of fact, and they exploited those laws to maximize the power of government agents to hurt innocent people. Now, the same kinds of laws that disarm innocent people in America will endanger and harm the people. But if the government doesn't have evil intentions, well, maybe the damage won't be as great as happened in Nazi Germany. But the problem is, once bad laws get on the books, they're hard to change or repeal. So the best plan is to make sure bad laws never get on the books, and then you can repeal those that are left.
Well, Richard, we all know there have been some other nations that have imposed gun control laws that left people defenseless, disarmed, and set them up for murder. Probably be useful to go through a short list of what those countries are.
Yeah, exactly.
They still are, maybe.
Yeah, well, in some cases, who knows? The Soviet Union may have been the biggest killer of all. It had basically a prohibition. It had a series of laws that were enacted after the communists took power in 1917. And our book, Death by Gun Control, goes through and shows each additional evolution of the law and how it tightened and further tightened restrictions on private ownership of firearms, such that it got to where you pretty much had to be a party member to have a firearm legally in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union ended up wiping out 10 or 20 or 30 and some even higher figures, but somewhere between 10 and 20 million of its own citizens who were defenseless in the latter part of the 1930s and early part of the 1940s. Soviet Union then is one of the biggest killers, but we also had Cambodia in the 1970s with their genocide. We had China, history of China both before and after the communists took power was one of very stringent so-called gun control. And they had mass murder on a scale that's just unbelievable. Uganda, a small country, had something like 300,000 people of its killed by its own government. Uganda had imported strict so-called gun control laws to be sure that they knew who had firearms and only people really loyal to the regime could have them. Guatemala has something like a 150-year history of so-called gun control laws, and Guatemala has had local persecutions and killings in that very small country. And a lot of that's owing to the fact that the persecutors were armed and the victims were not. Most recently, Rwanda, and people have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda. Well, that whole horrific event took place in a land where the defenders were systematically prohibited or discouraged from having firearms for defense. So in Rwanda, the results there were that the aggressors didn't have to have guns because the victims were completely powerless. They were so powerless that the aggressors could use machetes and clubs studded with nails to wipe out people. It was absolutely horrific. In fact, when the defenders, for example, sometimes there would be an attack in a town and the defenders would run to a church thinking they might have sanctuary there. Well, the attackers didn't respect the church. But if one guy inside the church had a firearm, he could hold off a whole squad or a whole regiment of attacking aggressors until he ran out of bullets. That's how powerful firearm is compared to not having one. And we cover this in great detail in our book, Death by Gun Control, and quite vividly in our documentary, which is Innocence Betrayed. And they go through the genocide and mass murder conducted by governments all over the world.
Yeah, one person mentioned to me that Innocence Betrayed was vivid enough you could almost smell the corpses.
Oh, my.
At any rate, well, okay. As we wrap this up, there are one or two resources that you would advise listeners to get their hands on to get educated on the subject of the law and how dangerous the law has become. What would those resources be?
Well, sure. Talked about earlier in our conversation today about The Law by Frederick Bastiat. I recommend that. Right after that would be Death by Gun Control or our film Innocence Betrayed. Either one or both of those. They cover slightly different materials. There's a lot of duplication, but then there's different materials in both sources, so there's something for everyone there. Another great book is called The Road to Serfdom, and that's written by Friedrich Hayek. It's a famous book. It's, again, fairly short, and it looks at the issues we've been talking about today from a view of economic policy, but you'll see the same thread of idea running through it. A couple other books on the list I would suggest to people to read. One is Lost Rights by James Bovard, which came out in the early 1990s. And that book, Lost Rights, shows how encroaching federal laws and law enforcement policies are degrading freedom in America. In the 90s, another book by Vin Suprinowicz. Easier to search on the name of the book than on the name of the author. But his book is entitled The Ballad of Karl Drega, D-R-E-G-A, Karl Drega. This is a book, collection of news essays that tell the actual stories of counterproductive laws, oppressive law enforcement in America in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We mentioned also The State versus the People by Claire Wolfe and by you. And that, of course, is practically an encyclopedia of these same things, showing what's actually happening in America and asking the question, how much of this will we tolerate before we start to realize that we're in a police state? I'm not saying we're in there yet, but you can see the kinds of forces that move you toward a police state and kinds of facts that work together. And I would suggest if people could read these resources or watch the film, they'd start to understand about what the law is, the law as a system, and how the law can be perverted to destroy rights, destroy lives. For people who would want to see a fictional account, I really like this new book, Rebel Fire. It's called Rebel Fire, and it's Rebel Fire Out of the Gray Zone, I think is the full title. And it vividly describes a future world that could be there for our grandchildren right here in America if the trends continue. And it's not a book about guns and firearms and that kind of thing. It's a book about recognizing when you're oppressed and you're not going to take it anymore. And it's a heroic story. I really enjoy that. People can get that at www.rebelfire, R-E-B-E-L-F-I-R-E, rebelfire.com. Those are the resources I would suggest to people.
Richard, I want to thank you for being with us today. Richard has been our guest talking about the law. Richard is an attorney and author who has written extensively about freedom and the law. I'm your host, Aaron Zellman, and I'd like all of you to remember, if you won't defend your rights, then don't complain when you lose them.
Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of JPFO.org or its members. Talkin' to America is a production of JPFO.org.